Welcome to episode, I'm going to say 23, of Michael Reads from a Book, a series in which I read from a series of books. Today's reading selection is Show Sold Separately by Jonathan Gray. It's a book essentially about taking Gerard Genette's term paratexts and applying it to media products. The quick explanation for this is that a paratext is anything that affects a reading of a book that isn't what we think of normally as part of a book. It can include things such as stuff in the book, like the publisher's information, or it can include things like, say, an interview you've heard with the author or other books that you've read by the author. If you bring it to a television show, then a commercial you've seen for the show counts, any sort of merchandising you've gotten for the show, even like a message board where people talk about the show. All part. This is Chapter 4, Under a Long Shadow, Sequels, Prequels, Pretexts, and Intertexts. In Chapter 1, I offered multiple metaphors by which we can make sense of paratexts. An airlock, as high priest of textuality, as overflow as convergence. But on a basic level, we can understand them as intertexts. Intertextuality refers to fundamental and inescapable interdependence of all textual meaning upon the structures of meaning produced by other texts. In common usage, intertextuality refers to instances wherein a film or program refers to and builds some of its meaning off of another film or program, an intertext to the referenced film or program. For instance, West Side Story invokes the intertext of Romeo and Juliet. The Colbert Report relies on its viewers' intertextual knowledge of pundit shows to parody and satirize programs such as The O'Reilly Factor. And The Sopranos intertextually plays with and reworks gangster movie tropes. Intertextuality is a system that calls for the viewer to use previously seen texts to make more sense of the ones at hand. As Lawrence Jenney notes, it introduces a new way of reading which destroys the linearity of a text, instead opening the text up to meaning from outside, so that often much of our understanding of a text will be constructed outside of the text. And while it is more obvious in examples such as West Side Story, The Colbert Report, The Sopranos, no text creates its meaning for itself by itself, as viewers will always make sense of a new text, using structures and orders of meaning offered to them by other texts, genres, and viewing experiences. Intertextuality is always at work, and with texts framing each other just as I have shown paratexts to frame texts. In this regard, paratextuality is in fact a subset of intertextuality. What distinguishes the two is that intertextuality often refers to the instance where one or more bona fide shows frame another show, whereas paratextuality refers to the instance where a textual fragment or peripheral frames a show. However, paratextuality and intertextuality regularly bleed into and rely on each other. As Genette uses the word paratext, he implies a form of subservience to a greater entity. Even if textually the paratext may prove constitutive of that entity, paratexts are generally outgrowths of a film or program. But what of an instance when a show is seen as an outgrowth of another show, as an extension that is functionally subservient and dependent? In such cases, shows can and should be analyzed as paratexts. Paratextuality and intertextuality, though, are intertwined in that intertextual frames are not wholly personal and insular. Rather, talk and discussion will circulate intertextual frames, suggesting ways that one may interpret a show, or forming an entryway or in medias res paratext that is fully realized and powerful as are trailers, ad campaigns, or bonus material. Intertextuality, in other words, often works through the calcified form of paratexts, such as viewer discussion. Thus, this chapter will examine various ways in which paratexts do the work of intertextuality, and various ways in which paratextuality and intertextuality combine. Michael Ian Polsky notes that By creating a specific intertextual field as its own environment, each text in its own way seeks to organize and reorganize intertextual predecessors, thereby also creating its own history of culture. But I will examine how paratexts, or shows working as paratexts, or operationalize this process. In particular, I am interested in how such intertextual fields are created before we even sit down in the cinema or turn on the television. Valentin Volosanov argues that what is important about a text is, quote, not what that it is a stable and always self-equivalent sign, but that it is an always changeable and adaptable sign, end quote. Tony Bennett explains Volosanov and Bakhtin's intertextual theory by observing that, quote, the function of any single text in relation to other texts, and hence its function, is liable to constant shifts and displacements as a new form of writing transforms and reorganizes the entire system of relations between texts. In this chapter, I will focus on how paratexts manage such changes, adaptations, shifts, and reorganizations. The big sample text for this chapter is the Lord of the Rings Online, or not Lord of the Rings Online, just Lord of the Rings, and how they act as a paratext for the other films and other filmic adaptations of novels, including the Chronicles of Narnia. He also looks at how Batman Begins attempted to escape the cloud of its own paratext, Batman and Robin. And finally, the chapter closes out with the paratext discussion of Lost and 6 Degrees. So it's basically how the book works. It starts off with a little tiny bit of theory and then adapts it rather fully to examine a few object texts. Personally, I would have preferred more video games, but I always prefer more video games. And when it comes to paratext, Stephen E. Jones, yes, and Mia Consalvo have this video game area pretty well covered. That's it for this time. See you next time.